Right before we dive in, let's make this story bigger than just me and you. Tell me in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from, and what's the clock striking there? Morning, night, or somewhere in between, I want to see how far this story can reach. Now lean closer. Here's where it all begins. The gun was already in Margot Delacroix's hand when the stranger whispered those words in her ear, his breath warm against her neck, as the saloon erupted in chaos around them. 3 dead men lay sprawled across the sawdust floor of the Silver Dollar, their blood pooling beneath overturned tables, while smoke from gunpowder hung in the air like morning mist over a battlefield. The piano had stopped mid-song, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the stranger's steady heartbeat against her back. "Dance like you're mine tonight," he had said just moments before the shooting started, his voice carrying promises that seemed impossible in a world where trust was a luxury few could afford. Now, as she pressed against him for protection while chaos reigned around them, Margot understood that those words had been both invitation and warning. A prophecy of violence wrapped in velvet and delivered by a man whose eyes held secrets darker than the Louisiana bayou at midnight. The stranger's arms encircled her waist with surprising gentleness for someone who had just demonstrated lethal precision with a Colt revolver, his body forming a shield between her and the remaining gunmen who were scrambling for cover behind overturned furniture. She could feel the steady rhythm of his pulse, unnaturally calm for a man who had just killed 3 professional killers without breaking a sweat or disturbing the feather in her hair. Through the haze of gun smoke and terror, Margot caught glimpses of faces she recognized, men who had been hunting her across 3 territories, determined to collect the bounty that had been placed on her head by someone with enough money to buy death and enough hatred to make it personal. But none of them seemed willing to take another shot, while she was pressed so closely against the mysterious cowboy who had appeared from nowhere to save her life. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the groans of wounded men and the nervous shuffling of saloon patrons who were trying to decide whether to run or hide. But even as she asked the question, Margot realized she was afraid of the answer, because any man capable of such deadly precision was either her salvation or her destruction, and in her experience, the two were often indistinguishable. 3 weeks earlier, Margot Delacroix had been living a lie so perfect that even she sometimes forgot which parts were true. In the boomtown of Esperanza Creek, she was known as Marie Dupuis, a respectable widow who owned the town's only bakery, and attended church every Sunday with her Bible clutched in hands that smelled of flour instead of gunpowder. The transformation had taken months to perfect, but it was the kind of reinvention that the frontier offered to those desperate enough to claim it. The bakery had been more than just a cover. It had been a dream of the life she might have lived if circumstances had been different. If choices had been made by someone else, if the world had been kind enough to let a woman start over without paying for every mistake in blood. She had genuinely loved the simple rhythm of kneading dough and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and nourishing from basic ingredients, finding peace in the alchemy of flour and water and hope. But peace was a luxury that Margot's past refused to allow her to keep, and it came calling in the form of a telegram that arrived on a Tuesday morning when the desert sun was painting the mountains gold, and her latest batch of bread was cooling on wooden shelves. The message was brief and unsigned, but its meaning was crystal clear. "We know where you are. Payment is due. You have 3 days." The words hit her like bullets, shattering the carefully constructed fiction of her new life. The man who delivered the telegram was a stranger, but his eyes held the cold professionalism of someone who killed for money rather than passion, and his casual examination of her bakery's layout told her everything she needed to know about his true purpose. He wasn't just a messenger, he was reconnaissance, cataloging escape routes and potential witnesses while delivering a death sentence disguised as Western Union correspondence. That night, Margot packed her few precious belongings and burned everything else, watching 3 months of careful construction turn to ash and smoke, while she prepared once again to become someone else, somewhere else. The woman who had briefly been Marie Dupuis died in those flames, replaced by whoever Margot would need to become to survive what was coming, a hunter, a fighter, or perhaps just another victim in the endless cycle of violence that seemed to follow her like a shadow across the American frontier. Margot's real story had begun 5 years earlier in the elegant parlors of New Orleans, where she had been known as Margot Delacroix, the sheltered daughter of a wealthy cotton merchant who believed his money could protect his family from the ugly realities of a world built on blood and exploitation. Her father, Armand Delacroix, had made his fortune by looking the other way, while his business partners engaged in activities that would have horrified his society friends: human trafficking, illegal gambling, and the kind of political corruption that turned elections into auctions. The revelation of her father's true business had come on her 18th birthday, delivered by a federal marshal whose investigation had uncovered financial records that connected the Delacroix family to some of the most notorious criminals operating between Texas and Florida. "Your father's associates won't hesitate to kill anyone who might testify against them," Marshal Thompson had warned her as federal agents ransacked the family mansion, including his daughter, if they think she knows too much about their operations. The choice had been simple but devastating: testify against her father's criminal associates and enter federal protection, or refuse to cooperate and face almost certain death from men who eliminated witnesses as casually as most people swatted flies. She had chosen survival over loyalty, providing evidence that led to the conviction of 17 criminals and the destruction of a criminal network that had operated with impunity for decades. But federal protection had proved to be a temporary shield rather than a permanent solution, and when the program's funding was cut and her handlers reassigned to other cases, Margot found herself alone and unprotected in a world where her testimony had made her a target for every survivor of the criminal organization she had helped destroy. The price on her head was substantial enough to attract professional killers from across the frontier, men who viewed her not as a person, but as a profitable opportunity. The 5 years since leaving federal protection had been a masterclass in survival, teaching her skills that no finishing school had ever offered: how to change her appearance and identity, how to recognize threats before they became deadly, and most importantly, how to shoot accurately enough to stay alive when running was no longer an option. Each new town had been another chance to reinvent herself, another opportunity to become someone whose past couldn't catch up with them. But each failure had made the next attempt more desperate and the stakes increasingly lethal. The Silver Dollar Saloon in Perdition Gulch had been meant to be just another stop, another place to disappear for a few months, while she planned her next move toward California and the promise of a new life far from the reach of men who turned murder into mathematics. But even as she sat alone at a corner table, nursing a glass of whiskey and trying to blend into the crowd of miners and cowboys, Margot could feel eyes watching her with the intensity of predators circling wounded prey. They had found her faster than ever before, arriving in Perdition Gulch less than a week after she had stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a carpet bag and a carefully constructed story about being a traveling seamstress looking for work. The men who hunted her had grown more sophisticated in their methods, using telegraph networks and railroad connections to coordinate their searches across multiple territories simultaneously. The first one she spotted was Jacques Boudreau, a Creole bounty hunter from Louisiana, whose reputation for violence was matched only by his reputation for never giving up once he had accepted a contract. He sat at the bar drinking bourbon and watching her in the mirror behind the bottles, his hand never straying far from the pearl-handled revolver that had ended the lives of a dozen fugitives across the American South. The second hunter was less obvious but far more dangerous, a woman named Céleste Tran, who posed as a traveling preacher's wife, but whose real profession involved separating people from their lives in ways that appeared accidental or natural. She had taken a room at the hotel across the street from the saloon, positioning herself where she could observe all entrances and exits while maintaining the perfect cover of respectability. The third member of the hunting party was the most terrifying of all, Thomas the Surgeon Mackenzie, a former Union Army doctor who had discovered that his medical knowledge made him exceptionally efficient at causing pain and extracting information from unwilling subjects. His presence meant they wanted more than just her death. They wanted answers about other federal witnesses and testimony that could still damage their surviving criminal associates. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the saloon filled with evening customers, Margot realized she was trapped in a web that had been closing around her for days without her knowledge. The cowboy who changed everything walked into the Silver Dollar like he owned the place, but not in the swaggering way of men trying to prove their importance to a room full of strangers. Instead, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to fear, his boots making barely a whisper against the wooden floor as he approached the bar. Everything about him suggested danger held in careful check, from the way his coat was cut to accommodate hidden weapons to the systematic way his eyes cataloged every face in the room. He was tall and lean with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years spent under the desert sun. His dark hair touched with premature silver that suggested he had seen more violence than most men twice his age. But it was his eyes that made Margot's breath catch in her throat, pale green like sage in moonlight, carrying intelligence and compassion in equal measure, along with something else that made her pulse quicken, despite the danger surrounding them. When he ordered whiskey, his voice carried the faint trace of an accent that might have been French or Spanish, refined enough to suggest education, but roughened by years of hard living. The bartender served him with the respect reserved for men whose reputations preceded them, and other patrons unconsciously gave him space without appearing to notice they were doing so. This was clearly someone who commanded attention without demanding it, whose presence changed the dynamics of any room he entered. Margot watched him through lowered lashes, trying to determine whether he represented another threat or a possible opportunity for escape. Professional killers came in all varieties, and some of the most dangerous ones looked like romantic heroes rather than obvious villains. But when their eyes met in the mirror behind the bar, she saw something that made her heart skip. Recognition, not of her face, but of her situation, as if he understood exactly what kind of danger she was facing. He finished his drink with deliberate slowness, his attention seeming to focus on the amber liquid, while his peripheral vision tracked the movements of every person in the saloon. When he finally turned from the bar and walked directly toward her table, Margot felt her hand drift toward the derringer hidden in her skirts, uncertain whether she was about to be rescued or whether her final confrontation was about to begin with an invitation to dance. "You're sitting in a crossfire," the stranger said quietly as he approached her table, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear the words. 3 hunters, 6 escape routes, and about 10 minutes before they make their move. Would you care to dance while we discuss your options?" His invitation was delivered with the casual courtesy of a gentleman asking a lady to waltz, but his eyes held the intensity of someone planning a military operation. Margot's training kicked in automatically, her mind racing through possibilities while her body remained perfectly still. Standing up to dance would make her a more visible target, but would also give her mobility and access to the dance floor near the saloon's rear exit. Staying seated kept her in a defensive position but offered no options for escape when the shooting started. "You seem very certain that shooting is going to start," she replied, matching his quiet tone while studying his face for signs of deception. "Because I'm very familiar with the men who are hunting you," he said, extending his hand with old-world gallantry that seemed incongruous in the rough frontier saloon. "Jacques Boudreau has been drinking steadily for the past hour, which means he's building up courage for something unpleasant. Celeste Tran hasn't moved from her window position in 40 minutes, suggesting she's waiting for a signal. And the surgeon just ordered coffee instead of whiskey, which means he wants to stay sharp for delicate work. The casual way he rattled off the names and habits of professional killers sent ice water through Margot's veins, because it meant he was either connected to them professionally or had been watching them as carefully as they had been watching her. "And what makes you think I need rescuing from these people?" she asked, her hand tightening on the derringer while she tried to determine whether his offer of help was genuine or another layer of the trap that was closing around her. "Because 5 years ago, your testimony sent my brother to federal prison instead of a shallow grave," he replied, his voice carrying pain that was too raw to be fabricated. "Antoine Thibodaux died in his cell 3 months ago, killed by men who wanted revenge against the woman whose courage had destroyed their criminal empire. I'm here to make sure his sacrifice meant something by keeping you alive long enough to see justice fully served." The revelation hit Margot like a physical blow, because Antoine Thibodaux had been the federal marshal who had first approached her about testifying, the man whose patient kindness had convinced her to risk everything for justice. If this stranger was his brother, then he represented either salvation or the most elaborate revenge plot she had ever encountered, and she had exactly 10 seconds to decide which before the dance floor became a battlefield. Margot placed her hand in his with the careful precision of someone accepting either salvation or damnation, feeling the calluses of a working man mixed with the steady pulse of someone whose nerves were under perfect control. As he led her onto the dance floor, she became acutely aware of how exposed they were, standing in the center of the room while potential killers watched from the shadows. "If you're planning to betray me," she whispered as they began to waltz, "this is an elaborate way to do it." "If I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead," he replied matter-of-factly, his arm around her waist, guiding her through steps that seemed unconsciously elegant, despite the lethal tension crackling around them. "My name is Gabriel Thibodaux, and I've been tracking the same people who have been hunting you for the past 6 months. The difference is that I want them dead, while they want you to suffer first." The music provided cover for their whispered conversation, while Gabriel's eyes continuously tracked the movements of other patrons, his body positioning them so that potential threats had to move through predictable fields of fire to reach them. Margot found herself trusting his lead, not just in the dance, but in the deadly choreography he was conducting around them, using the waltz as both camouflage and tactical positioning. "Boudreaux is getting restless," Gabriel murmured as he spun her gracefully, the movement allowing him to scan the entire room without appearing to do anything more than show off his dancing partner. "He's moved to a table with a clear shot at the dance floor, and his coat is unbuttoned for quick access to his weapons. We have maybe 2 minutes before he decides subtlety isn't worth the effort." As if summoned by Gabriel's prediction, the saloon doors swung open to admit 2 more men whose presence made several patrons suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. These weren't local cowboys or traveling merchants. They were professionals whose very bearing spoke of violence held in careful check. "Friends of yours?" Margot asked, though she already knew the answer from the way Gabriel's jaw tightened. "The Marchand brothers," he confirmed grimly, his hand tightening on hers as he prepared to transform their waltz into something far more deadly. "Which means the price on your head just doubled and my timeline just got cut in half. When I say move, you go left toward the bar and don't look back until you reach the rear exit." The romantically whispered instructions carried the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions, and Margot realized that their dance was about to become a fight for survival. The piano player's hands froze mid-chord as Jacques Boudreaux stood up from his table, the scraping of his chair against the wooden floor creating a sound like fingernails on a coffin lid. In the sudden silence that followed, Gabriel pulled Margot closer. Their bodies pressed together in what appeared to be an intimate embrace, but was actually a defensive formation designed to minimize their profile as targets while maximizing their options for sudden movement. "Dance like you're mine tonight," Gabriel whispered against her ear, his words carrying multiple meanings as the tension in the saloon reached a breaking point. To anyone watching, they looked like lovers lost in each other's eyes, but Margot could feel the coiled violence in his muscles and the way his free hand had drifted toward the gun concealed beneath his coat. The endearment was both genuine affection and tactical instruction. She needed to move with him as if they were truly partners in every sense of the word. Boudreaux's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk, his Creole accent thick with anticipated pleasure. "Mademoiselle Delacroix," he called out formally, "your presence is requested by parties who have waited far too long for this reunion. Come quietly, and perhaps we can discuss terms that benefit everyone involved." But his hand was already resting on his gun, and his smile held the cold satisfaction of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. The Marchand brothers had positioned themselves near the main entrance, effectively cutting off the most obvious escape route, while their presence discouraged other patrons from interfering in what was clearly about to become a professional matter. Celeste Tran had abandoned her window post and was now visible near the stairs leading to the saloon's upper rooms, her preacher's wife disguise doing nothing to hide the deadly intent in her eyes. Gabriel's response was to dip Margot dramatically, the romantic gesture concealing his draw as he pulled his Colt in one fluid motion while using her body to shield the movement from the watching killers. "Counterproposal," he said conversationally as he straightened, his gun now pressed against Margot's back, where it couldn't be seen but could be brought to bear instantly. "You all walk away now, and I let you live long enough to regret taking this contract." The words were delivered with the calm politeness of someone discussing the weather, but they carried the unmistakable promise of violence that made every professional in the room reassess their tactical situation. Boudreaux's laugh was cut short by the thunder of Gabriel's Colt, the shot so perfectly timed that it seemed to emerge from the silence itself rather than breaking it. The Creole bounty hunter's gun had barely cleared leather when the bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the floor while blood bloomed across his white shirt like a crimson flower. The sound of the gunshot released every other person in the saloon from the paralysis of tension, and chaos erupted as patrons dove for cover behind overturned tables while the remaining hunters scrambled to adjust their tactics to account for Gabriel's unexpected speed and accuracy. Margot found herself moving without conscious thought, her body responding to Gabriel's guidance as he spun her away from the line of fire while simultaneously engaging multiple targets. The elder Marchand brother went down next, Gabriel's second shot catching him in the leg as he tried to rush the dance floor with a sawed-off shotgun that would have turned both dancers into bloody rags. The younger brother showed more sense, diving behind the bar and using the solid wood as cover while he tried to get a clear shot at the couple who had transformed from easy targets into lethal opponents in the space of 3 heartbeats. Celeste Tran proved why she had earned her reputation as the most dangerous woman in 3 territories, producing a small pistol from beneath her modest dress and putting 2 shots uncomfortably close to Gabriel's head before he could adjust his position to engage her effectively. Her accuracy was remarkable, but her position near the stairs limited her angles of attack and gave the dancing couple precious seconds to maneuver. "The bar!" Gabriel commanded, his voice cutting through the gunfire and screaming with military precision as he guided Margot toward the thick wooden structure that offered the best cover in the room. But even as they moved, more men were pouring through the saloon's entrance, reinforcements who had been waiting outside for their moment to join the hunt. The trap that had been closing around Margot for days was finally springing shut, and only Gabriel's deadly skills stood between her and a fate that would make death seem merciful. As bullets splintered the wood above their heads, Gabriel pulled Margot down behind the bar where broken glass and spilled whiskey created a treacherous landscape that reflected the muzzle flashes like tiny stars. In the relative safety of their improvised fortress, She could see his face clearly for the first time since the shooting started, and what she saw there made her understand that everything she thought she knew about this man had been carefully constructed misdirection. "You're not just Antoine's brother," she said, her voice cutting through the gunfire with sudden certainty. "You're Gabriel, the angel Thibodaux, the bounty hunter who disappeared 3 years ago after cleaning out half the criminal organizations between here and Mexico. Every story I heard about you suggested you were dead." The revelation came with a mixture of relief and terror, because his reputation was legendary, but so was the price on his own head. Gabriel's smile was grim as he reloaded his weapon with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed. "Being dead has its advantages when you're hunting people who think they've eliminated all their enemies," he replied, his eyes never stopping their systematic scan of potential threat vectors. "Antoine's death brought me out of retirement because some debts can only be paid in blood, and the people who killed him need to understand that justice has a long memory." The sound of breaking glass from the front windows announced that their attackers were escalating their tactics, using rifle fire from outside to supplement the pistol work happening inside the saloon. Gabriel's expression darkened as he recognized the strategic implications of coordinated assault from multiple directions. "This isn't just about collecting a bounty anymore," he said grimly. "They've committed too many resources for this to be a simple assassination. Someone very important wants you dead, and they're willing to start a war to make it happen." Margot felt her blood turn to ice as she understood what he was telling her. "The Federal Witness Protection Program," she whispered, pieces of a larger puzzle finally clicking into place. "Someone inside the program has been selling information about protected witnesses to the people they testified against. That's how they've been finding me so quickly, how they always seem to know where I'm going before I get there." The implications of that revelation hung between them like smoke from the gunpowder, because if the federal government itself had been compromised, then there was nowhere left to run, and no one left to trust. The only question was whether Gabriel's legendary skills would be enough to keep them alive long enough to expose the corruption that had turned witness protection into a hunting license, or whether they would both die in this anonymous saloon, their secrets buried with them beneath the desert sand. The rifle fire from outside intensified, systematically destroying every piece of cover in the saloon while driving the few remaining innocent patrons toward the rear exit in a panic that served the attackers' purposes perfectly. Gabriel's jaw tightened as he recognized the tactical sophistication of the assault. This wasn't the work of simple bounty hunters, but of military professionals who understood siege warfare and coordinated assault techniques. "Federal agents," he said grimly, his words barely audible above the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass. "Someone with serious government connections has decided that covering up their corruption is worth burning down half of Perdition Gulch, which means we're not just fighting for your life anymore. We're fighting to expose a conspiracy that reaches all the way to Washington." Margot's mind raced as she processed the implications of what Gabriel was telling her, understanding finally why her pursuers had become so much more sophisticated and well-funded in recent months. "Marshal Thompson," she whispered, the name falling from her lips like a curse as she remembered the man who had first recruited her into witness protection. "He was the only one who knew all the details about my testimony, the only one who had access to my complete file and relocation records." The sound of boots on broken glass announced that their attackers were moving closer, using the covering fire from outside to advance through the destroyed saloon while maintaining tactical formation. Gabriel's expression became deadly calm as he prepared for what he clearly recognized as a final assault designed to end the confrontation permanently. "Thompson's been selling witness information to fund black operations that Congress won't authorize," he said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who had spent months investigating the conspiracy. "You're not just a witness anymore. You're evidence of federal corruption that could bring down careers and end political ambitions. The realization that she had become a liability to the very people who were supposed to protect her hit Margot like a physical blow, but it also crystallized her resolve in ways that mere survival never could. "Then we make sure that evidence reaches the right people," she said, her voice gaining strength as purpose replaced fear. "Antoine died trying to do the right thing, and I won't let his sacrifice be meaningless because corrupt officials decided that justice was less important than their careers." Gabriel's smile was fierce and proud as he heard the steel enter her voice, recognizing the moment when a victim transforms into a fighter. "Then we'd better survive the next 10 minutes, he said, checking his ammunition one final time as shadows moved through the smoke-filled saloon. "Because dead witnesses can't testify, and dead bounty hunters can't deliver justice." The sound of approaching footsteps told them both that their time for planning was over. Now came the moment when courage would be tested against overwhelming odds in a fight that would determine not just their survival, but the fate of justice itself. Gabriel's plan was simple in concept, but devastating in execution. Instead of waiting for their attackers to overwhelm their position, he would take the fight to them using the element of surprise and superior knowledge of close-quarters combat. "Stay low and follow my lead," he told Margot as he prepared to vault over the bar. "We're going to punch through their line and take the fight outside where we have room to maneuver." The move caught their attackers completely off guard, turning their careful tactical advance into chaos as Gabriel emerged from cover like an avenging spirit, his guns blazing while he moved through the smoke-filled saloon with deadly precision. 2 men went down before they could adjust to his sudden appearance, their carefully coordinated assault dissolving into individual panic as the hunter became the hunted. Margot followed in his wake, her own derringer accounting for a third attacker who tried to flank Gabriel while he was engaged with multiple targets. The months of running and hiding had taught her skills she never thought she would need, and now those hard-learned lessons were keeping her alive as she moved through the battlefield that the saloon had become. Fear was still there, but it was controlled fear, the kind that sharpened reflexes rather than paralyzing them. Celeste Tran proved to be the most dangerous opponent, her position near the stairs giving her multiple angles of attack, while her experience as a professional killer made her difficult to pin down. Gabriel found himself forced to use precious ammunition, keeping her suppressed while simultaneously dealing with the Marchand brother who had recovered from his leg wound and was now firing from behind the piano. The breakthrough came when Margot spotted the surgeon trying to circle around behind Gabriel's position, his medical bag in one hand and a large-caliber revolver in the other. Instead of calling out a warning that might distract Gabriel at a crucial moment, she took her own shot, the small derringer proving surprisingly effective at close range. The surgeon's scream of pain and rage announced to everyone in the saloon that the prey had developed fangs, and the psychological impact was worth more than the physical damage. The rear exit beckoned like salvation itself, but the alley behind the saloon proved to be another carefully prepared killing ground where armed men waited in the shadows with rifles trained on the doorway. Gabriel's experience showed as he read the tactical situation instantly, pulling Margot back into the saloon just as the first shots cratered the doorframe where their heads had been moments before. "Upstairs," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos with military authority as he identified their only remaining option for escape. The saloon's second floor offered height advantage and multiple windows that could serve as alternative exits, but reaching the stairs meant crossing open ground under fire from multiple directions while their ammunition was running dangerously low. The dash across the saloon floor was a nightmare of bullets and broken glass, with Gabriel providing covering fire while Margot ran for the stairs with everything she had learned about survival driving her forward. Celeste Tran's position near the staircase made her the primary threat, but Gabriel's accurate shooting forced her to take cover just long enough for Margot to reach the relative safety of the upper floor. The saloon's second story was a maze of small rooms connected by narrow hallways, offering both concealment and confusion as they tried to find a window that didn't face into rifle fire from the street. Gabriel's knowledge of building construction served them well, as he identified a window overlooking the alley between buildings, a gap too narrow for their attackers to cover effectively, but wide enough for desperate people to navigate. "There's a roof across the alley," Gabriel said, studying the distance with professional assessment. "It's a hell of a jump, but it's better than staying here to be cornered like rats in a trap." The window was small and the drop was significant, but the alternative was facing professional killers in an enclosed space where their superior numbers would eventually tell. As the sound of boots on the stairs announced that their pursuers were following them up, Margot realized that sometimes survival required leaping into darkness with nothing but faith to break the fall. The window frame splintered under Gabriel's boot as he kicked it outward, creating an opening barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, while bullets from the hallway chewed chunks out of the wall around them. The gap between buildings yawned like a mouthful of teeth, the distance seeming to grow with each second they hesitated while their attackers closed in from behind. "Ladies first," Gabriel said with grim gallantry. But Margot shook her head as she studied the treacherous jump that represented their only chance of escape. "Together," she insisted, understanding that if one of them fell, the other would likely die trying to help rather than abandoning their partner to continue the fight alone. The loyalty was tactical as much as emotional. They had become a team in the crucible of violence, and teams survived or died together. The leap was a moment of pure terror, followed by the jarring impact of landing on the opposite roof, both of them rolling to absorb the shock while slate tiles shifted and cracked beneath their weight. Gabriel's shoulder struck the roof's edge hard enough to send a shower of broken masonry into the alley below, but he managed to maintain his grip on both his weapon and his determination to keep fighting. Behind them, the saloon erupted in fresh gunfire as their pursuers discovered the open window and realized their quarry had escaped the trap once again. Voices shouted orders in the alley below as the coordination effort shifted to tracking them across the rooftops of Perdition Gulch, but the maze of buildings offered concealment that hadn't been available in the confined space of the saloon. "We need horses," Gabriel said as they caught their breath in the shadow of a brick chimney, his tactical mind already working on the next phase of their escape. "And we need them before they organize search parties and lock down the entire town. There's a stable 3 blocks south, but getting there means crossing open ground where we'll be exposed to rifle fire from multiple directions." The challenge was clear. They had escaped immediate death only to face the larger problem of getting out of a town that was rapidly becoming a hunting ground designed specifically for them. As they moved across the rooftops with cat-like precision, Gabriel's expression grew increasingly grim as he spotted the systematic deployment of armed men throughout Perdition Gulch. "This isn't just a bounty hunting operation," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had finally understood the true scope of what they were facing. "This is a federal cover-up operation designed to eliminate all witnesses to corruption that reaches the highest levels of government." Margot felt her blood chill as she processed the implications of what he was telling her, understanding finally why her pursuers had seemed to have unlimited resources and government-level coordination. "Marshal Thompson wasn't just selling information," she whispered, pieces of the conspiracy falling into place with horrifying clarity. "He was running his own operation, using federal resources to eliminate witnesses while making it look like routine criminal violence." The sound of approaching horses told them that their time for reconnaissance was running out, but Gabriel's sharp eyes had spotted something that changed everything about their tactical situation. "Federal badges," he said grimly, pointing toward a group of riders who were positioning themselves to surround the stable they had been planning to reach. "Thompson brought an entire task force to clean up this mess, which means everyone in this town is either a target or a potential witness who needs to be silenced." The revelation that federal agents were actively hunting them rather than protecting them stripped away Margot's last illusion about justice and law enforcement, leaving her with the bitter understanding that corruption had infected the very institutions designed to serve justice. "Then we're not just fighting for our lives," she said, her voice gaining strength as anger replaced fear. "We're fighting to expose a conspiracy that's turning the federal government into a criminal organization." Gabriel's smile was fierce as he heard the steel in her voice, recognizing the moment when a victim becomes a crusader, willing to risk everything for justice. "Then we'd better make sure we live long enough to tell the story," he said, checking his remaining ammunition while studying the tactical situation below. "Because dead heroes don't expose corruption, and dead witnesses don't get justice for the people who trusted them. The odds were overwhelming, and the enemy was their own government. But sometimes, the most important battles were fought by the smallest forces against the greatest darkness." Gabriel's plan was audacious to the point of insanity, but it was also the only strategy that offered any hope of survival against federal agents with unlimited resources and official authority. "We're going to steal their telegraph equipment," he explained, as they studied the federal command post that had been established in the hotel across from the saloon. "Send our evidence directly to Washington, to people who have the power to investigate corruption within the Marshal Service." The approach required them to cross 3 blocks of open ground, while federal agents systematically searched every building in Perdition Gulch. But Gabriel's knowledge of military tactics and Margot's desperate courage combined to create opportunities where none should have existed. They moved like ghosts through shadows, using the chaos of the search operation to mask their own movements while closing in on their target. The hotel's telegraph office was guarded by 2 federal agents who clearly considered their assignment routine security rather than active combat duty, a mistake that proved fatal when Gabriel and Margot struck with the desperation of people who had nothing left to lose. The brief fight was silent and decisive, leaving them in possession of both the telegraph equipment and federal credentials that could authenticate their message. Margot's fingers flew over the telegraph key as she transmitted everything she knew about Marshal Thompson's corruption, the witness protection scandal, and the federal cover-up operation that was currently turning Perdition Gulch into a battlefield. Each word sent represented another nail in the coffin of the conspiracy that had destroyed so many lives, but it also made the sound that would inevitably draw their enemies to their location. "Message sent," she announced as the transmission ended, her voice carrying satisfaction mixed with the understanding that they had just painted even bigger targets on their backs. "Whatever happens now, the truth is in the hands of people who can do something about it." But even as she spoke, the sound of boots on the hotel stairs announced that their enemies had discovered their location, and that the final confrontation was about to begin with odds that made survival seem like an impossible dream. The hotel room became a fortress, as Gabriel barricaded the door with furniture while Margot positioned herself near the window to provide early warning of attacks from multiple directions. The federal agents outside weren't bothering with subtlety anymore. They wanted this situation ended quickly and permanently, with no survivors to contradict whatever official story would eventually be filed about the incident in Perdition Gulch. "They're bringing explosive charges," Gabriel observed grimly as he watched the preparations below, his military experience recognizing the tactical signs of an operation designed to bring down the entire building if necessary. Thompson's decided that collateral damage is acceptable if it means eliminating all witnesses to his corruption. "We've got maybe 5 minutes before they turn this place into rubble." The sound of splintering wood announced that the barricaded door was being attacked with axes and crowbars, federal agents working systematically to breach their defenses while other teams prepared to assault through the windows. Margot checked her Derringer one final time, understanding that she was down to her last 2 bullets against an enemy that numbered in the dozens. "I want you to know," Gabriel said as he prepared for what seemed like their final battle, That meeting you has been worth every bullet and every risk. Antoine would be proud of what you've accomplished, and proud of the courage you've shown in standing up for justice, even when justice seemed impossible. His words carried the weight of someone saying goodbye, but they also carried strength that made Margot feel like she could face anything. The door burst inward in a shower of splinters and federal badges, but Gabriel's guns were already speaking their deadly language as professional killers disguised as lawmen poured into the room. The fight was desperate and close quarters, with no room for mercy or hesitation as the corruption of law enforcement met the justice of those who refused to be silenced. In that moment, Margot understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds, because the alternative was a world where truth had no voice and justice had no champions. The sound that saved their lives came from outside, the thunder of horses ridden hard by men who knew they were racing against time and death itself. Through the gun smoke and chaos, Margot caught a glimpse of badges that weren't federal, worn by men whose faces carried the grim determination of honest lawmen responding to corruption within their own ranks. The cavalry had arrived, but not in the form anyone had expected. "Texas Rangers," Gabriel said with amazement and relief as he recognized the distinctive uniforms and tactical formation of the elite law enforcement unit that had earned its reputation by cleaning up messes that other agencies couldn't or wouldn't handle. "Someone in Washington took our telegraph message seriously enough to dispatch the one law enforcement agency that Thompson couldn't corrupt or intimidate." The hotel erupted in fresh violence as federal agents found themselves caught between the Rangers outside and Gabriel's desperate defense inside. But this time, the tactical advantage had shifted decisively. Rangers with rifles were systematically eliminating the federal agents who had been using explosive charges to threaten the building, while others were securing escape routes and establishing perimeters that would prevent anyone from fleeing. Captain Sam Houston Walker himself led the assault through the hotel, his legendary reputation for incorruptible justice preceding him like a force of nature that made even corrupt federal agents think twice about continuing their resistance. When he kicked open the door to their room, Margot felt tears of relief streaming down her face as she realized that justice still existed in a world that had seemed completely corrupted. "Miss Delacroix?" the Ranger captain said formally, his voice carrying the authority of Texas law and federal mandate combined. "I have orders from the Attorney General himself to place you under protective custody while we investigate allegations of corruption within the Federal Marshal Service. Your testimony has already resulted in arrest warrants for Marshal Thompson and 17 of his associates." The words carried the promise that truth had finally found its voice, and that voice had been loud enough to reach the right ears in Washington. The aftermath of the Perdition Gulch incident moved with the inexorable force of federal justice once corruption had been exposed and political will had been mobilized to address it. Marshal Thompson was arrested in his Denver office while trying to destroy evidence, his carefully constructed criminal empire crumbling as witnesses came forward and financial records revealed the scope of his betrayal of federal law. Margot found herself testifying before a federal grand jury in San Antonio, her words carrying weight that had been missing during her original testimony years earlier. This time, she wasn't just another witness against regional criminals. She was the key to exposing systematic corruption that had infected federal law enforcement itself. The protection surrounding her was real and comprehensive, provided by Rangers and federal agents whose loyalty had been verified through extensive investigation. Gabriel's role in exposing the corruption earned him not just a presidential pardon for his vigilante activities, but an offer to join the Federal Marshal Service as part of its reform and reorganization. His reputation as the Angel took on new meaning as newspapers across the country reported how a legendary bounty hunter had risked everything to protect an innocent woman and expose government corruption. The trials that followed were sensation across the nation, with reporters from major newspapers covering every detail of how witness protection had been turned into a hunting license and how federal resources had been used to silence rather than protect those who trusted in American justice. 17 federal agents were convicted and sentenced to federal prison, while systematic reforms were implemented to prevent similar corruption in the future. But for Margot and Gabriel, the most important trial was still to come. Not in a courtroom, but in the small church in San Antonio, where they had decided to exchange vows under the protection of Texas Rangers and the blessing of honest federal agents who understood that love was sometimes the most important witness of all. The woman who had stood alone at a saloon was about to dance like she belonged to someone who had proven worthy of that trust through fire and gunpowder and unwavering dedication to justice. 6 months later, Margot Delacroix walked down the aisle of the little church in San Antonio wearing a dress of white silk and lace that had been purchased with reward money from the capture of corrupt federal agents. The congregation was small but significant. Texas Rangers, honest federal marshals, and newspaper reporters who had covered the corruption trial sat alongside the few friends she had made during her months of federal protection. Gabriel waited at the altar wearing the badge of a federal marshal and the expression of a man who had found something worth more than all the bounties he had ever collected. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, Captain Walker stood up with mock seriousness and announced that the state of Texas and the federal government had both approved this marriage as being in the interests of justice and public safety. The ceremony was simple but profound, with vows that had been forged in gunfire and tested by betrayal, but proven stronger than corruption or fear. When Gabriel took Margot's hand and promised to protect her not just from enemies, but from ever having to stand alone again, there wasn't a dry eye in the church, including among the hard-bitten Rangers who had seen enough of life's cruelty to recognize true love when it appeared. The first dance at their reception was a waltz, of course, played by a piano player whose hands were steady and whose music filled the air with joy rather than the prelude to violence. As they moved together on the dance floor, Margot remembered that night in the Silver Dollar when Gabriel had whispered, "Dance like you're mine tonight," and understood that some prophecies were meant to be fulfilled not just for a single evening, but for a lifetime. As the music swirled around them and the candlelight painted their faces in gold, Gabriel leaned close to his wife's ear and whispered the words that had started their journey together, but now carried new meaning. "Dance like you're mine forever," he said, his voice thick with emotion and promise. And as Margot smiled up at the man who had risked everything to save her, she understood that she had found something rarer than justice or safety. She had found a partner worthy of every dance, every risk, and every tomorrow that lay ahead of them in the vast, dangerous, beautiful frontier that they would face together as husband and wife, lawman and witness, protectors of the innocent and champions of truth in a world that desperately needed both.